You know what they say? The bigger they are. Well, that's not how we say it in Judaism. In Judaism, we modify. We have a similar but very, very different version, which is the higher they are, the lower they reach. It's a very valuable thing to remember, because just generally across the board. And if that sounds like a little bit of an abstract concept, there's an easy way to understand it. For example, if you're trying to explain something to somebody else, depending on how well you understand it yourself, they will determine how easily you could explain it to somebody. Or let's say it differently. If you understand something really, really well, then you can explain it to people who know absolutely nothing. Whereas if you don't understand something all that well, you can only explain it to people who kind of know the topic, and then they at least feel familiar and they're actually doing part of the work for you. So that's why we say the higher they are, the lower they can reach. The higher, that doesn't just mean how much information I know about something. Just because I have a lot of information does not mean that I can necessarily share that information in a meaningful way. The point is that when I understand something at a very high level, then I can really explain it to somebody else. So let's try and understand that for a second, because it's going to be relevant to our conversation. Let's say that you have learned academically about a particular subject, but you've never had real life experience with that subject. Let's say that you've read a whole lot of books about surgery, but you've never been a surgeon. Now you have to explain to somebody, somebody's asking a question about surgery. As much as you have information, you're still not going to be able to explain it in a way that they really understand what you're talking about, because you haven't reached that height called experience. Now you've just reached the height of information. Whereas a person who's actually been in theater and had hours and hours and hours of surgical experience, they can speak from a perspective that gives them clarity. When they have that clarity, they can explain it to somebody else. That's why it says about Shlomo HaMelech, Vayidaber shloishes alofim moshel, that Shlomo HaMelech was able to give 3,000 parables on a subject. That doesn't mean he was very creative. It doesn't mean that he had a vivid imagination. It means that he understood things at their essence, and so he could explain it to 3,000 levels of audience. No matter where you were, he could explain it to you. So that's the principle we're going to have to deal with today, is the higher something is, the lower it could reach. So we're now at the level called Yesod. It's difficult to translate Yesod with an accurate translation, and at the same time link it to one of the midos. Doesn't seem to work. Again, in our mind, how do we translate midos, or how do we understand midos? Character traits, right? The things that define us, the things that define our persona. Now, if you want to say chesed, that sounds like a trait, the trait of kindness. If you want to say gvura, whether it be strength or discipline, it sounds like a trait. But how do you translate Yesod? Yesod translates as a foundation. A foundation, solid, right? So very often we say about a person, they're a very solid person. We use that expression, right? Somebody's a very solid person. What do we mean? Right? What does it mean? What kind of a trait is it to be solid? Now, I know the minute you say that, you start to think about unwavering and the resilient, the fact that what? Deep roots, right? And deep roots is a very, very powerful statement, because the question is, what do deep roots look like in a spiritual system? In a physical system, we know exactly what they look like, but what do they look like in a spiritual system? So that's a good observation, right? So what exactly do we mean when we say foundation? So how's that different to netzach, right? Because we said that netzach is this perseverance, this commitment, and we need to obviously see a nuance over here. There's got to be some kind of a difference. So what exactly are we referring to when we say the foundation? Not really. So let's think about this for a second. When you talk about the foundation of a structure, where is the foundation? It's where you can't see it. Okay, that's the first thing that you've got to consider. The foundation of something is invisible on the surface. Now, the reason that that's relevant to Yesod is because Yesod is the beginning of the process of sharing. Remember, everything we've discussed until now, as dynamic and as powerful as those aspects might have been, they are not necessarily shared. And it's really, really important we understand this. So for example, let's go back for a second to chesed, which we said is synonymous with love. It's possible that a person has a very strong love for somebody and they don't share it. Possible. The nature of midos is that they can survive and they can be fully expressed internally. There's no guarantee that just because a midah is so alive and so dynamic that I necessarily have the tools to be able to actually share it. So seeing as we're now on the cusp of sharing, that's why we're calling this the Yesod. In other words, if I'm looking at somebody from the outside, I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea what feelings they're feeling right now. Okay, some people don't do such a good job of hiding their feelings. But that's not the point. The point is, it is quite possible, you look around the room, it's quite possible that people are sitting in this room right now harboring all kinds of very intense feelings, positive or, God forbid, not so positive. And we don't know about it. Just because I have an experience that is very personal and very intense does not necessarily mean that it's out there in the public. So the beginning of that bridge to sharing is Yesod. That's why we're relating it to a foundation, because from the outside we cannot see this foundation being built. Any observer of the person can't tell that the person is about to create that connection. They're about to share. We don't know that. So that's why it would be considered like a foundation. It's one of the reasons, okay? But let's understand this a little bit better. Now, in order to understand this a little bit better, we need a little bit more information. Because a translation doesn't help us. We've learned that already, right? A translation on its own doesn't help us. We need a little bit more information. And in this specific case, what we're going to do for our information is we're actually going to start with a person. Now, we know who the icon of Chesed is. That was easy. We know the icon of Gevurah is. Even Tiferes, that was quite easy. Netzach, Hoid, not so simple. There are quite a number of places that say Netzach and Hoid are all about Nevuah. So prophets generally are in the world of Netzach and Hoid. But is anybody aware of a personality in Tanakh? Okay, I'll be a little bit more specific. In the Chumash, who is the representation of Yesod? Okay, so there we got one vote for Yosef. Yosef. They say Abraham is Chesed. Moshe is Chochmah. Okay, so it is Yosef. You are correct. It is Yosef, right? I'll tell you an interesting thing just by the way, and that is that we know that the days of the week are associated with these particular midos, as we identified right at the beginning of the conversation. And so as a result, Friday, which is the 6th day, corresponding to the 6th midah, which is the midah of Yesod, has a lot of association with Yosef. So let's just do a quick poll over here. On Friday night, do you cut or break your challah? Cut? Yes? Everybody here cut the challah? Okay, any Sfardim in the room? Right? Sfardim break the challah, right? Why does Sfardim break the challah? Because when Yosef was looking after the economy of Egypt and he had to provide food for everybody at a time of a famine, so the Torah uses the expression Vayishbor Yosef bar. The direct translation is that he distributed food. Bar is more specifically produce. So he had these storehouses of produce and he shared it and he spread it to everybody. Now the word Vayishbor in its most literal translation is he broke. Vayishbor Yosef bar. Yosef broke bread. That's probably where the expression comes from, to break bread. So in the Sephardi tradition, which is a more Kabbalistic tradition, seeing as Friday is associated with Yosef, and Yosef is associated with Vayishbor bar, so you break rather than cut the challah. Okay? So anyhow, so there you see an association between Yosef and Midas HaYesod. Okay, what else? Why else have you ever heard that Yosef is associated with Yesod?
Because he kept true to his principles.
Okay, he kept true to his principles. And, hang on 1 second. He kept true to his principles and
always said that it was Hashem that was doing it.
Okay, why is that Yesod?
Because he's sharing with everyone that he's got something.
Okay. He shared the food. That's the thing. He is the person who supplies food for people. That is the association with Yesod. Remember, Yesod is the basis for sharing, and Yosef creates the system whereby he, as effectively the person in charge of the whole world's economy at the time, so he creates a system whereby they can have what to share later. So during the famine, maybe the people in Egypt saw what he was doing, but the rest of the world who were going to come, because the Torah tells us, right? Everybody came to Mitzrayim to get food, They didn't see what was going on. They didn't see the foundation that was being built for their sustenance. So there you have this link between Yosef and Yesod. Okay, what else? He shares his dreams, correct? Of course he did. Avraham shared as well. Exactly. So where's the distinction? We haven't yet seen a distinction. Good point.
And then deep in the dungeons, and then he went up.
Good. Okay, so you got Yesod is that which is kind of beneath the surface, and Yosef starts. He actually builds his career from, so to speak, beneath the surface. Right? He's in the pit, and then he's in prison, and he builds his career from there. Why is forgiveness Yesod?
Because he's sharing of his ability.
I think that's already a little bit more of a stretch.
He shares his expertise with the others.
Okay, fair enough. Again, I don't know if that's unique to Yosef per se. I don't know if that's unique to Yosef, because you could say Yitzchak does the same when he digs wells. So he's sharing, how to dig well. I don't know. I'm not sure that is absolutely Yesod. Okay, so here's the thing. Here's the thing that's very, very important to understand, and it's key to our conversation over here. We know that every one of the Sephiros is associated with a part of the human anatomy, and Yesod is associated with the reproductive organs. The greatest challenge that Yosef had in his life was around relationships. All the relationships. So on the one hand, he has a very unique relationship with his father. So again, obviously the reproductive organs represent connection and relationship. He has a very unique relationship with his father. He has a very troubled relationship with his brothers. And then the pinnacle of his spiritual testing is Potiphar's wife. So that is very much the world of Yesod. Yesod, and here's another way to translate it. Instead of translating it as foundation, which is accurate, another way to translate it would be to translate it as bonding. Yesod is the trait of bonding. And that's very much what we're going to be speaking about over here today. This trait of bonding. Now remember that every one of the midos in human experience, every one of the midos could be positive or it could be negative. And every one of the midos carries a different weight of how bad it is when it's negative. Okay? So obviously they're all very positive when they're good, but how much damage could we cause when they're negative is going to be different from each of the spheroids. So let's just think about this for a second. What's that?
You've got Dina that corresponds with Yosef.
Dina and then Osnas, it's like a whole story, right? Which is also a story of relationship.
Yeah.
Dina, Yatzoni Soisa, she went out, she kind of made relationships that went a bit out of control. Okay? So the thing about relationships, about Yesod, about bonding, is it is possible. Let's just use Chesed as an example, right? So we said at the beginning when we spoke about Chesed, that Chesed could be very positive because a person could be loving and kind and generous and tolerant, which are all wonderful things. Or we said it could be a person who is undisciplined, a person who is an enabler, a person who is tolerant of things that nobody should tolerate, and that could be really negative. The thing is, what we also have learned about Chesed is that Chesed does tend to run out of steam over time, and that's why I needed the backing of Netzach. So even if a person gets into a really bad kind of habit, it's still possible that we could redirect them. Whereas, and that the same would apply to most of them, but Yesod is when you bond with something, that implies that it becomes very personal. And when something becomes very personal, if it's on the positive side, it will be very enriching. But if it's on the negative side, it will be very damaging. So for example, the Torah tells us with Yosef that when Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, he said clearly that he refused lishkav ima v'liyoisima. He didn't want to sleep with her and he didn't want to be with her. So the Gemara says, why do I need both expressions? So the Gemara explains, he didn't want to have a connection with her in this world, nor did he want to have a connection with her in the next world. And then the Gemara goes on to explain that if a person engages in an inappropriate relationship, that relationship accompanies them into the next world. It affects the neshama as well. That's the power of Yesod. Yesod is when you bond very deeply with something, and when that happens, it creates permanence. So again, let's just put this into terms that we can all relate to. Remember, we're not yet actually communicating at the level of Yesod. We're just preparing to communicate. But you know what happens in people's heads when they prepare to communicate? I mean, let's be honest. Has it ever happened to you that you've had a conversation in your head with somebody else and you're already upset at them before having the conversation? can happen, right? So that's Yesod. Yesod is when we start to attach ourselves to a particular feeling, perspective, relationship. It could all happen still within ourselves, and yet it creates a platform that is a very difficult platform to undo. So as long as I'm just kind of living with things in a theoretical sense, okay, theories can change. Convince me otherwise. The minute I become personally invested in something, that's a whole different story. Now, the minute I said becoming personally invested, at this point, you hopefully remember that we're in the middle column of the 3 columns of the Sephiros. And then you remember that part of that middle column is Da'as. Now, remember we said that Da'as is when you become personally attached to an idea. That's what Da'as was, as opposed to academically studying an idea. Da'as means that it actually means something to me. And we also said that Da'as is used as a euphemism in the Torah to represent intimacy. So it's no surprise that there's a direct link between Da'as, as things happen in the intellectual realm, and Yesod, as things happen in the character realm, in the emotional realm. It's the same concept. It's the deep personalization of stuff. Now, what does that look like? And once we understand what it looks like, it will help us understand what it means in the world of Sephiros. So first we've got to understand what it means in the world of ourselves, and then we've got to understand what it means in the world of Sephiros. Now, to get to all of that, let's go back to our friend Yosef, right? How did Yosef get his name?
His mother said she wanted to add to...
Right? His mother said, Yosef Hashem li ben acher. Now, there's a lot riding on that statement, by the way, because what she's saying, at face value, she's saying, please God, Hashem should add another son for me. In other words, there's this leaderboard between the 4 matriarchs, who's going to have enough children to make up the total of the 12 Shvatim. And Leah is way ahead of everybody else. And Rachel is hoping to at least have 2 sons, because then she'll be the equivalent of Bilhah and Zilpah. So her prayer, even though she's had a breakthrough after years of infertility, now she's had a son, and you'd expect her to be dancing on the rooftops. Instead, her request is, Yosef Hashem li ben acher. Let Hashem please add another child to me. So that's what the word Yosef means. It means to add, right? It means to add. Even though she also says, Osaf Hashem escher pasi, that Hashem has gathered up my shame. So there's that implication as well. But the more direct translation of the word Yosef is to add. Yosef Hashem li ben acher, to add. By the way, there's a deep, and she gets her bracha fulfilled. Obviously, she has the son Binyamin. But by the way, there's another deeper meaning to this statement. It tells us a lot about who Yosef is and what Yosef represents. And the minute you hear this, Yosef's entire story just kind of makes sense. Yosef Hashem li ben acher, as we know, you could always read statements in the Torah, because there's no punctuation, you could always read it slightly differently. Yosef Hashem li, may Hashem add to me, ben, a child, acher, who previously was foreign. Okay, that's another way you could read it. So in other words, to take an acher, somebody who is outside of the pale, somebody who is off the rails, or as we like to call it, off the derech, and make them a child again. That is Yosef's story. Unlike his brothers, the brothers very much wanted to live in a nice, holy, healthy environment, and that was going to be good for their spirituality. And that's why they didn't like what Yosef was doing, because Yosef immediately, at the youngest age, stepped out of that world. And he was playing with fire, dressing with this fancy, multicolored cloak, and doing his hair, and not being a shepherd like the rest of the brothers. That was foreign to them. But that's Yosef's track in life. Yosef's track in life is you go out into the world, you impact the world, and you add value from the world. Right? Yosef Hashem li ben acher. You take that which was acher, that which was foreign to Judaism, and you bring it in to be part of Judaism. And Yosef succeeds in doing just that. That is Yosef's life. Yosef is a person who goes into Mitzrayim, which the Torah calls Ervas Haaretz, the most amoral place on earth. Not only is he not influenced by Mitzrayim, but he takes control of Mitzrayim. Becomes the most powerful person. And he deliberately does things, like Rashi tells us, he deliberately moves the people around so that later, when there would be the Egyptian exile, the Jews wouldn't feel or at least at that point they were called still Israelites, they wouldn't feel as foreigner as they might have, because everybody had been moved out of their territory. So he plays with the entire system. He controls not only the country at the time, but even the destiny of that country. So he's Yosef Hashem li ben acher. He's the person who transforms the negative into positive, who transforms the lowest, the darkest, the most immoral into having a role to play in the growth of holiness and the growth of Torah eventually. So that's what I said right at the beginning. The higher they are, the lower they can reach. So Yosef comes obviously from a very high level. That's why in the Zohar they call him Tzaddik Elyon, like a supreme tzaddik. You get a regular tzaddik, which is an extremely high level of spirituality, and then you get a tzaddik elyon, which is like a tzaddik on spiritual steroids. So that's where Yosef is. He's at an extremely high level, and as a result of that, he's able to reach down into a very lowly place and transform it and elevate it. That's what Yosef means, to add. Not just to add more things, more mitzvahs. It's to add that which previously was negative, turning that positive. That's the greatest Yosef that you could achieve. It's the greatest achievement. It's the greatest turnaround that is possible. So now that tells us a lot of what Yesod is. Yesod is about forging real connection and real relationships, not only between us and others. That's the easiest level of Yesod. But the real power of Yesod is creating connection and bonding between the world and Hashem. Because that's what Yosef, not bringing light to the nations, bringing the nations to the light. And it's a very important distinction. It's a very important distinction. Because if I'm taking light to people, that does not necessarily mean that they have been transformed. It just means that I'm sharing with them. Whereas if I'm bringing them to the light, then it is Yosef. I have added something that was not previously here. It wasn't previously part of the world of holiness. And that's what Yosef represents. So this is very much what Yesod is about. At the simplest level, it's about creating relationship. But at a far deeper level, it's about transforming things from one reality into another. Now, there's a lot that we have to unpack in that world. Let's first start just simply in very simple, accessible terms that we could all relate to. The concept of Yesod, meaning the concept of bonding, always requires two parties. In other words, you can't just bond with yourself. There's no real value in that. So the implication of bonding is that you're connecting to something or someone outside of yourself. Okay, so that already implies that there are two stages, and in those two elements, typically the person who is activating the Yesod is typically the person taking the lead, taking initiative, and then the other party will be the beneficiary of that Yesod. So let's use an example that's quite an interesting example because it's layered, and that is a teacher and a student. Now, in order for a teacher to successfully teach the student, there has to be a bond. You understand why? Because if you just walk into a classroom and a whole bunch of kids sitting in the classroom and you just start sharing the curriculum, that's going to be a terrible idea, right? It's going to have useless outcomes. What you have to do is you have to create rapport with the students. The Gemara tells a story about Rabbah, right? That before he used to give a shir, he used to say, Milsa divdichasa, which in its most loose translation means a joke, but I can guarantee you now the kind of joke that he told was probably at a level that we would be sitting there scratching our heads trying to understand what he meant. You know, we're talking at a high level, but the point is he used to start off with something which was lighter. Why did he do that? Because you have to create a bridge. You have to create a bridge. If there's no bridge, if there's no connection, if there's no bond, then you cannot actually teach. You cannot actually share. So teaching is one example. The truth is, it applies to any example. So we spoke about empathy, right? Tiferes, which is in the middle column. So Tiferes, if you really want to share empathy with somebody, you first have to create a bond with them. Can't just say, you know, I empathize, as people sometimes do, right? I empathize with you. No, you can't say that. You can't say empathy. You have to feel empathy, which means that you actually have to connect with the person. You have to create that bridge. And as we well know, of course, each of these 10 sephiros is present in all the other sephiros. So in order to have true empathy, you actually need the Yesod aspect of Tiferes in order to have real empathy that actually connects. Okay? So in order for people to have a connection between them, there needs to be this concept of Yesod. Yesod meaning I actually take an interest in the other. This is a shift. Up until now, all of the spheros that we have described, all of the midos that we have described, don't necessarily consider the other. Even empathy doesn't necessarily consider the other. Empathy as it is on its own is, am I empathic? I need the Yesod aspect to say, am I empathic to you? Okay? So up until now, we've been speaking essentially about the pristine elements of what make up our character, which is effectively our character in theory. Yesod is the part that turns our character into practice, or at least creates the groundwork to be able to share that character in a meaningful way. So let's go back to the example of the student and the teacher and the student. So the teacher is what we will call the mashpia. That means that this is the initiator. That means that the teacher is the one who has the resource. And we're going to call the student the mekabel, or the mushpa, the recipient, the beneficiary, who obviously needs to be reeled in, needs to be attracted, needs to be engaged in order for this relationship to happen. Now,
male and female.
correct. That's why it's a relationship. Reproductive organs, exactly. Now, anybody who's ever taught in their life will be able to resonate with what I'm going to say now. When you walk into a class that has that kid, that kid who has given you gray hairs, it's very difficult to really bond with that kid and potentially with other children in the class because of the amount of time and energy that that child is taking. So therefore, your capacity for teaching will end up being limited.
Yeah.
If you walk into the class and you've got that kid, this kid is just a joy, an absolute gem. They are switched on. They ask good questions. They're respectful. They connect with you personally. You'll teach at a level that you surprise yourself. I didn't even realize how enthusiastic I'd be about this. Let's take that up a notch. What if you have an opportunity, and I'm not talking in a classroom setting because that could sometimes be awkward, but you have the opportunity to teach your own child. So you're sitting down with your child and you're teaching something to your own child. At that point, you will probably give your child things that you don't give to ordinary people because you are so invested. In other words, the nature of Yesod, which is the nature of bonding between people, is a spectrum. Just because there's a bond happening does not necessarily mean that it's a rich bond that's happening. Sometimes we connect with people because we have to. And all we're going to give them is our absolute most superficial layer. So for example, you get pulled over by a traffic cop. Now, at this point, there is going to be a connection. You have to communicate. Now, before the traffic cop comes to your window, the Yesod is already being established, which is how you're going to deal with this. In fact, I saw quite an unnerving scene as I was driving here now. And if I wasn't coming to the shir, I probably still would have driven on. But so what happened was there were two cars stopped on the side of the road, and the one driver was a black guy, and the other driver and his passenger were two white guys. And I saw these guys get out of the car and march over to his car. I don't know what had happened. It didn't look like there was any major damage, like if anything was a scratch or whatever. But wow, the anger on this guy's face, it was, I know it's a judgmental thing to say, but I honestly feel like I haven't seen like that kind of racism boil up in a person. And I don't know the people, I don't know the context, but you could just see it in his eyes. This was not about what had happened. It was quite a scary thing to see, you know. So the Yesod of that relationship, and it's not a long-term relationship. That relationship is going to be the few minutes that they scream at each other, it's your fault, it's your fault. But the Yesod of that relationship, before they've said a word to each other, has been created. And you could see it in that particular scenario. You could see it, the body language. I mean, this guy, it was actually frightening. Like my feeling was, you know, jump out and protect this other guy. Not that I could, but I'm just saying, you know, like, so when the cop is coming to your window, you already established the Yesod. The Yesod is probably going to be disdain, cynicism, you know, okay, he probably just wants lunch, you know, whatever goes through our minds. the level of connection is going to be extremely, extremely superficial. And even if we are the kind of person who's generally cordial, and the person comes over and we say good morning and we offer our license and we do go through the step, the reality is we're not going to invest a whole lot of ourselves. So while they're busy, looking at the license, whatever, we'll probably be doing something else or looking elsewhere, whatever the case is. Whereas if you have a deep connection with somebody, then when there's a Yesod opportunity with that person, there's going to be a huge amount of investment in that opportunity without you even realizing. This is not a manual thing that we do. We say, oh boy, this is my child, I better really focus. I mean, sometimes we do that, but generally what happens is, because this is my child, without even realizing it, it activates my whole system at a high level. I'm much more invested. And I'm hyper alert, and I'm much more excited about the child, right? So that's what Yesod does. That's what Yesod does. It takes whatever is going on internally, and depending on how deep the Yesod, now you see how deep the foundation goes, depending on how deep those roots are, that will determine how much it stimulates the rest of the system in this interaction.
So phenomenal. I just want to share this because it might be helpful in just kind of solidifying the concept. I've been in sales for many years, and I've sold things in my early years that like corporate clothing that just didn't even mean anything to me, and I was terrible at it. And I feel like those were my formative years in learning how to be rejected and like what humility is. And then what happened through the years is, as I became more of an expert in my field and I started to sell people things that were good for them, and I could genuinely connect with people. And then simultaneously, about 3 years ago, there's this concept of the guide and hero. There's a guy in America who's come out with the brand story. And you basically set up your brand in such a way that you become the guide, and the person who you're selling to becomes the hero in their own story. It's this, whatever. And what I find quite phenomenal is that the root of this is Yesod. Because the only way that you can I could effectively sell something to someone is if I knew through research what they needed or how I could help them, not me be the hero, but them be the hero. And in creating that connection, was able to sell them something that enriched their own life. And in terms of that, I mean, my sales obviously effectively grew, into something not only meaningful, but also, you can see a shift monetarily in trying to sell corporate clothes.
Okay, very good.
You're going to help a person versus anti-allergy products.
But it also works the other way around. Like the people you invested in the most, you're more hypercritical of them.
Yes. Yes.
I expect more from him than some random child.
This is true.
Understanding, more caring. There's one child I expect more, and I'm maybe rather harder.
This is true. So what Yesod is doing is it's stimulating the entire system. So whatever the dominant features are of my system are going to be heightened. So if I am more of a person with high expectations, then that's what's going to happen when I'm with my child. It's going to translate into a higher expectation, or being more demanding in that room or whatever. That's why it's awkward to teach your own child, because very often you treat them differently to everybody else in the classroom, and you try not to treat them differently, so then you overcompensate in one of the directions. But whatever it is that is my makeup, that gets escalated when Yesod is in play. Now, here's where it gets really powerful. So, in terms of the human anatomy, which remember is supposed to represent the whole concept of the spheroids, so we've effectively worked from the top to the bottom. That's effectively how we've done this. You'll see when we get to Malchus next week that it's a bit of an exception. But generally, we've spoken from the top to the bottom. And when we say the top to the bottom, we don't necessarily only mean in terms of the actual physical state of where everything is. It's also in terms of function. So the way Hashem has designed the human body is that you've got this incredible paradox that the same region of the body that has the capacity to reproduce is the same region of the body that expels all the waste matter of the body. So in a sense, it's very much the lowest part of the body. And yet, what it is able to achieve is something that the rest of the body is unable to achieve. Why? Because the brain is very much the highest, most developed part of the whole human experience, and yet all it can share, not all it can share, but all it can share is intangibles. So the brain can share ideas. And ideas are completely intangible, which means that the recipient may not get the idea properly, they may misunderstand, or they may hear a different idea at a later point that completely dispels the idea that we shared with them. So as complex and as advanced as the brain is, what it shares is not necessarily guaranteed to be of lasting value. Same applies to emotions. Emotions are also intangibles. So even if you share with somebody a lot of kindness, a lot of care, or you give them a clear, set of parameters, discipline, you help them define a strategy for themselves, whatever the case is, these are ultimately intangibles, which means either it will wane over time, out of sight, out of mind. I was actually thinking about it the other day. It's quite scary how quickly we can forget a person. And I'm not, God forbid, talking about somebody who's passed away. I'm talking about somebody who's moved away. It's incredible how quickly we can forget a person. Even though there was a lot of emotion and you could say, we were best friends for 20 years or whatever the case is, it's an intangible. And because it's an intangible, it can, even though it's so dynamic at the time, it can completely dissipate over time. Yet Yesod is about reproduction, which means Yesod creates something that can live independently. That's what Yesod is. It's the capacity to create something that can live independently. In other words, a child. Another human, not an idea, another human. That is the power of Yesod. That we're able to replicate ourselves. That's what our sages say is the closest you'll ever get to being God. Because Hashem creates yesh mi'ayin, something from nothing. And the production of a child is the closest experience we'll ever have to yesh mi'ayin. Right? Something from nothing. The way Hashem has designed the process is in order to conceive, there has to be a tremendous amount of energy and passion, which is reflective of the idea that in order to have a real Yesod, to have a real connection, a real bond with something, there has to be a lot of interest, there has to be a lot of investment, there has to be a lot of passion. So if we are really going to bond, for example, with our Judaism, it cannot just be academic. And the truth of the matter is it cannot even just be because I'm inspired. There has to be a lot of energy associated with it. But the chap is that here is where you see the highest of the high reaches the lowest of the low. Because in order, and it's a very, very interesting concept, very interesting. But in Kabbalah, there's a whole discussion about how the actual material that produces a child, which we know, of course, is physical, genetic material, has to first begin as a concept in the mind. Very simply, parents have to want to have a child. And not just in the generic sense of wanting to have a child. At the time of conception, they had to have wanted to conceive. So you've got this irony that on the one hand, you're talking about the brain, which is completely intangible. The thoughts are intangibles. And most intangible thoughts remain intangible thoughts. Again, you can translate the thought into action, but then the thought is not the action. Whereas the process, the biological process that produces the seed of a child has to begin with the thought of the parent. And that's why we have so much literature in Judaism about intentionality. When a couple is in the process of conception, how important it is that they have pure thoughts and that they are very focused on holy things, because that is the core of what this child will develop from. So you've got this incredible irony that you've got the highest part, in a sense, of the human being, which is the brain, and yet it's producing something so physical and so tangible, and yet so powerful. So, for example, we're told that malachim, angels, here we can take this back now from the human experience to the spheroids. Angels are called in Kabbalah the product of zivug neshikin. They're considered the product of a connection like two people kissing. Now, at the end of the day, when people kiss each other, it might be very passionate, but it has no lasting influence. It is what it is while it is. In fact, I'll tell you an interesting story. So there was a story, if I remember correctly, it was the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad, that he walked into his grandson's room. The grandson was a baby. He was going to be the next Rebbe of Chabad, the Tzemach Tzedek. And he saw him sleeping there, and he was overwhelmed with this incredible urge just to give him a big kiss. And instead, he turned around and he went to his room and he wrote a discourse, a Hasidic discourse. And when the grandson was older, he gave it to him and he said, this is a Hasidic kiss. Why? Because a kiss can be very fleeting. Whereas if you channel that passion into something which is lasting, it's a much richer experience. So malachim, angels, which in other religions, angels are considered to be very advanced and, you want to one day become an angel. In Judaism, we're a little dismissive of angels. I mean, I don't want to be irreverent, but we're a little dismissive of angels, because they have tremendous capacity and they're very spiritual, etc. But they also can't do any of the things we could do. All the angels in the world cannot produce a single mitzvah at the end of the day. Why? Because they are zivug neshikin. Because the dynamics, the energies that produce angels are very elevated energies, like the mind, which is very elevated, but they're intangible. So they don't actually have an impact. We, on the other hand, neshamos are called zivug, Zah v'nukva. Zah is a summary of the 6 midos we've learned till now. And nukva is the feminine energy, which we'll learn about, please God, next week, which is called malchus. The production of a neshama is compared to the intimacy between a man and a woman. Why? Because that intimacy produces an actual child. Something which is real, which lives, which has the capacity to make a difference. And so Yesod in the world of spheroids is the highest level. Remember, this is the central column. The central column is all of them are linked. The highest level we said is the level of Keser. Keser is a dynamic and energy that is greater than everything that exists, that is greater than the whole of the system. Where does Keser actually have an impact? At the level of Yesod, which means in the spheroids, Hashem has designed a whole world. And the nature of that world is that there are different kinds of energies, and those energies are in a hierarchical manner, and there are different levels of filter which allow the world to exist. But what is the purpose of all of that? Yesod. Because Yesod is where souls are born. And only souls are the purpose of creation because they can make a tangible difference. The highest of the high reaches down into the lowest of the low, or to put it into Yosef language, Yosef, you add. And what do you add? You add from the world of Acher. You add from the world that is outside of the holiness, outside of the structure of spheroids. Yesod creates the foundation for that to be able to happen. So in human experience, Yesod is about producing children. We know from last week's parasha that when it says toldos in the Torah, it's not only referring to physical children, it's also referring to spiritual children. So Yesod is to make a difference to another person, to share with another person in such a way that they transform, that they elevate. To be able to do that, I actually need the deepest level of manashama, but I don't know how to access the deepest level of manashama. So here's the wag the dog aspect to it. I don't know how to access the deepest part of my neshama, but when I step out of myself to truly connect with another person, to bond with them in order to bring them value, in order to have a positive influence over them, that in turn illustrates or exposes to me the depth of my neshama. So in Hashem's realm, Yesod is to bring the highest potential into the lowest beings, which are us. And in our experience, Yesod is to activate the deepest part of my neshama by truly connecting with somebody else to have a meaningful, positive, and uplifting influence over them.
That's joy, in a way.
It is a joy.